Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into one of the darkest and most bizarre chapters of the British monarchy, the tragic death of King George IV. This is no fairy tale about a majestic sovereign. This is the tragedy of a man destined to be the first gentleman of England, handsome, witty, and full of promise, who instead transformed himself into a repulsive symbol of decay. George IV, the king of the 19th century, squandered the nation's wealth on Roman banquets, magnificent, luxurious palaces like the Royal Pavilion, and unimaginable debt. He was so addicted to alcohol and laudanum, liquid opium, that his body swelled to over 120 kilograms, leaving him blind, requiring servants to carry him. And ultimately, his death brought his subjects only one emotion: relief. How did a golden heir end up as a foul-smelling living corpse, despised by his own people? How did his extravagance, gluttony, and addiction ruin his body, spirit, and legacy? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And just so I know where you're relaxing, please comment and let me know the city you're living in and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the annals of the British monarchy, the death of King George IV in the year 1830 is regarded as one of the most horrifying images of decadence and decay. Born on the 12th of August in the year 1762, Prince George Augustus Frederick was the eldest child of King George III and Queen Charlotte. His lineage was considered supremely noble. His father, King George III, was the longest reigning monarch in British history, known for his steadfast spirit and deep religious faith, while his mother hailed from the Mecklenburg-Strelitz dynasty, bringing to the British court an Asian-infused grace blended with European pride. George Augustus Frederick had at least 8 siblings, the most notable being Princess Elizabeth and Prince Frederick, familial relationships that, while bound by blood, often strained under the rigours of courtly discipline. From early childhood, he received a rigorous education at the Kensington Academy, under the supervision of renowned tutors in languages, history, and theology. That scholarly environment endowed the prince with a broad foundation of knowledge. He became fluent in French, developed a deep understanding of classical Roman and Greek literature, and honed his skills in horsemanship, fencing, and royal protocol. At the age of 18, George represented the British crown at the Peace of Paris conference, where he engaged with European diplomats and impressed them with his confident demeanour and warm, resonant voice. Yet despite his strict upbringing and leadership training, he occasionally displayed the impulsiveness typical of a royal youth. From his teenage years, the prince exhibited a fierce desire for freedom. He grew weary of solemn ceremonies and yearned for moments of adventure beyond palace walls. By the time he reached the age of 21 in the year 1783, Prince George officially relocated from Kensington Palace to Carlton House on Pall Mall in London, marking a turning point in both his living arrangements and behaviour. There, Carlton House became the epitome of his lifestyle, a gathering place for the upper class and celebrities, where lavish weekly parties took place, featuring abundant food, fine wines, and music that lasted until the early hours. Yet few knew that the prince had also contributed to reforming certain royal ceremonial regulations, advocating for simplified coronation attire to save the national treasury, ironically, an effort he would later undermine by squandering public funds more extravagantly than any other prince. In the year 1820, when his father fell into mental illness, George Augustus Frederick was appointed regent, effectively ruling in King George III's stead. Although this title did not make him king, in practice he administered the British government for nearly a decade, from 1820 to 1821. During his regency, he commissioned architectural projects such as the Blackfriars Railway Station and the redevelopment of Regent's Park for public enjoyment, helping shape a modern face for London. He also patronised the arts, inviting painters and architects to England, and laying the groundwork for the Regency-style neoclassical movement. However, alongside these contributions, Prince George gradually sank into a life of luxury, both in finances and reputation. He rode horses 4 or 5 times a day, indulged in hunting, and cruised the Thames on ornate pleasure barges. He amassed a lavish wardrobe imported from France, employing so many tailors and jewellers that he required an entire retinue to manage them. Although he played a positive role in cultural and architectural advances, His ostentatious behavior and boundless spending later became the main catalysts for public criticism and ridicule, as society condemned his waste of the public purse without bearing the heavy responsibilities of a monarch. Each morning the prince rose late, allowing musicians to play gentle melodies to rouse him, and then enjoyed a sumptuous breakfast. In the afternoons he received distinguished guests, discussed state affairs and the arts, before immersing himself again in late-night festivities. This attitude gradually eroded his image of royal solemnity, replacing it with that of England's first gentleman, a nobleman more committed to personal pleasure than national duty. The languid, dreamlike tone of his life reminds us of a figure both exalted and fragile, drifting in the long sleep of history, where luxury itself can become the most dangerous shackle. The 1780s marked a turning point in the lifestyle of George IV, as he transformed Carlton House into the epicenter of some of the most opulent entertainments in all of Europe. Whereas his father, King George III, extolled the virtues of frugality, discipline, and moral rectitude, George instead plunged headlong into dissipation and extravagance. A single morning's repast might consist of 2 plump pigeons, 3 thick cuts of beef steak, the greater part of a bottle of white wine, a glass of champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy, all consumed before the clock struck 10. Luncheons and dinners bore more resemblance to wild Roman banquets than to civilized meals, with tables piled high with meats and rivers of wine flowing endlessly. At the very same time, his debts mounted until the British Parliament found itself repeatedly intervening to rescue him from financial ruin, only to watch the prince immediately squander the funds on lavish jewelry, sumptuous furnishings, and grand palaces. Despite the repeated parliamentary bailouts, George's spending grew more reckless by the year. In the year 1785, defying both custom and statute, he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a widowed Catholic, triggering whispers of a constitutional crisis for contravening the Act of Settlement, 1701. That clandestine union, though deeply felt by the prince, remained legally invalid and politically incendiary, for the law forbade marriages to Catholics and required royal consent for any dynastic alliance. A decade later, duty compelled him into a marriage with Princess Caroline of Brunswick, an arrangement that brought nothing but disgrace and public scandal. Their wedding night concluded in ignominy, as the groom, overcome by drink and excess, collapsed unconscious before the hearth. Word of the incident spread like wildfire through London society, granting satirical caricaturists and gossiping pamphleteers free rein to lampoon the hapless couple. What might have been a personal embarrassment quickly became a national spectacle, with cartoonists delighting in each fresh humiliation. His utter lack of restraint, the ever-accumulating mountain of debt, and these notorious marital episodes collectively bore testament to George's guiding principle, that money existed not as a tool of stewardship or duty, but as fuel for his own desires. He pursued pleasure for its own sake, caring little for the burdens such profligacy imposed on the public purse or the dignity of the crown. Within the walls of Carlton House, the party never ceased. Elaborate banquets stretched across multiple courses, each more lavish than the last, featuring exotic birds, imported fruits preserved in sugar, spiced meats roasted whole, and desserts crowned with whipped cream. Servants in livery scurried to refill goblets with Burgundy, Champagne, Madeira, and ports from Portugal, until the air grew thick with the scent of ferment and spice. Musicians often imported from continental courts provided a soundtrack of harpsichord, violin, and gentle airs, lulling guests into a dreamy stupor despite the riotous excess around them. Yet for all the grandeur, the prince's private life remained tumultuous. His secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, while an expression of genuine affection, violated legislation drawn up to secure Protestant succession, and it threatened the very stability of the monarchy. Meanwhile, his forced marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, arranged by ministers anxious to secure his lineage, proved worse than any political miscalculation. It inflamed public opinion, casting George as a cruel, capricious husband, and Caroline as the aggrieved party in a union she never desired. In the months that followed, gossip proliferated on every corner of Pall Mall and Piccadilly. The prince's creditors lurked like vultures, waiting to pounce on any slip in payments, while courtiers jockeyed for favour in the shifting social tides of Carlton House. Music and laughter spilled into the early hours, accompanied by the clinking of glasses and the rustle of silk petticoats. Yet beneath the sparkling chandeliers and gilded ceilings, a sense of ruin hovered. A kingdom's finances stretched thin, a monarchy's credibility weakened, and a prince's reputation irrevocably stained. Thus, the 1780s stand as an era of both dazzling spectacle and profound moral decay in the life of George IV. His flamboyant pursuits and reckless spending left an indelible mark on the culture and architecture of London, no less than the grand facades of Carlton House and the sumptuous dresses of his courtiers. But these very achievements were inseparable from the darker truths of debt and scandal. For the same extravagance that elevated his name to glittering prominence also sowed the seeds of his later downfall. And so, as we drift through the memory of those years in a sleepy haze, we glimpse both the dazzling heights of his ambition and the yawning abyss into which he would eventually tumble. The animosity between George and Princess Caroline only deepened when he ascended the throne in the year 1820, formally becoming King George IV. Though invested with regal authority, he persisted in a relentless campaign of vilification against his estranged wife. He forbade her attendance at his coronation, an act that ignited public outrage and painted him as both petty and tyrannical. What had once been admiration for his handsome visage soured into contempt. By the year 1797, at the age of 35, the monarch weighed 110 kilograms. His once proud features bloated and sagging, with layers of flesh overlapping like cushions. Yet George resolutely clung to the trappings of courtly appearance. He laced his midsection into a wale, bone corset to compress his prodigious girth, donned elaborate powdered wigs, and rouged his cheeks in a vain attempt to conceal the steady march of time. In the year 1810, when his father, King George III, succumbed to mental illness, George Augustus Frederick was appointed regent, exercising all royal powers in his father's stead. Rather than mark this as a milestone of responsible governance, his regency became a gilded echo of his earlier revelries, magnified 100-fold. He lavished patronage upon the arts and architecture, commissioning new theatres, supporting the Royal Academy, and transforming London's social calendar into a season of dazzling spectacle. Under his watch, the city's ballrooms sparkled with crystal chandeliers and silk gowns, and his name was whispered with reverence at every salon. But behind the veneer of sophistication lay a darker truth. His banquets, though celebrated for their grandeur, were spectacles of excess bordering on the grotesque. Tables groaned under the weight of game birds and roasted meats. Fountains of punch and champagne overflowed into crystal goblets. Courtiers dutifully toasted his health, even as their eyes widened at the sheer scale of his consumption. Night after night, the prince turned regent revelled until dawn, his laughter echoing through the corridors while the silverware clattered and the music swelled. More troubling still was his deepening dependence on laudanum, a liquid opiate that left him insensate for days on end. He imbibed it with the same abandon he reserved for wine and spirits, often mixing the two, so that guests might find him inert in his private chambers long before the light of morning. Even his most hard-bitten companions, already accustomed to aristocratic excess, recoiled at the sight of him, sprawled across his couch in a stupor that persisted for hours. His drinking likewise escalated to unimaginable levels. He consumed rivers of claret, port, and brandy, pouring libations from barrel-sized casks set in gilded stands. Tasted one flavour, then another 40-year-old Madeira, vintage Burgundy, champagne, aged beneath the palms of the Indies, until the princely constitution buckled under the weight of alcohol. He would sometimes vanish from public view, only to re-emerge days later with bleary eyes and a trembling hand, his speech slurred, his thoughts mired in opiate haze. Yet, in his waking moments, he remained transfixed by the gleam of marble and gilt. He poured royal funds into remodelling Carlton House, cladding its facades with new stucco and erecting ornate pavilions in nearby gardens. Sculptors and architects clamoured for his patronage, each eager to leave a lasting imprint on the Regency aesthetic. Under his auspices, the epoch took on a neoclassical flair, with columns and pediments echoing ancient temples, while inside, salons were furnished with delicate chaise longues and hand-carved cabinets. Still, the glories of his reign could not dispel the underlying rot. His public insults towards Caroline of Brunswick, publishing private letters, accusing her of impropriety, and barring her from court functions, betrayed a vindictiveness that outraged even his own ministers. Opinion journals devoted entire issues to denouncing his cruelty, Cartoons in print shops caricatured his corpulence and cruelty in equal measure, and street cries of "Shame on the King" punctuated the London fog. Behind palace doors, the regent's inner circle grew uneasy. Advisers pleaded for restraint, imploring him to temper his drinking and to permit Caroline a conciliatory gesture for the sake of royal dignity. But their entreaties fell upon ears dulled by opium and wine. George dismissed them with haughty contempt, retreating further into his decadent domain of excess. Night after night, the court's festivities persisted. Dancers in silken slippers gliding across parquet floors, chandeliers dripping prisms of light like distant stars, orchestras playing minuets and adagios to soothe the senses. Yet in the early hours, as the music faded and the gathering dissipated, the king would be left alone with his vices, an emperor in name, a prisoner of his own rampant appetites. Thus, the Regency period stands as a paradox. An age of cultural flourishing made possible by a prince who himself was unraveling, undone by cup and opiate. The same hands that commissioned sublime artistry were stained by the compulsion to consume far beyond human limits. In those twilight hours, as the sun struggled to crest the horizon, a somnolent hush would descend over Carlton House, its corridors still bearing the echoes of revelry. And in his private chambers, King George IV would drift into fitful slumber, the ghosts of his excesses lulling him into dreams as ornate and perilous as his waking life. The Regency period, spanning from 1811 to 1820, bore witness to the unmistakable cultural and artistic influence of George IV. In those years he lavished patronage upon painters, sculptors, and musicians alike, endowing the Royal Academy with new funding and commissioning grand frescoes for the walls of Carlton House. He oversaw the remodelling of several royal residences, adding ornate salons, gilded mirrors, and silk-draped alcoves that glimmered beneath crystal chandeliers. Social seasons in London, once modest affairs, became the talk of Europe, as the regent's taste for spectacle drove him to host lavish balls that stretched into the early hours. Ladies in sweeping gowns of silk and taffeta seemed to float across polished floors, while gentlemen in embroidered coats bowed and whispered compliments beneath the warm glow of candelabras. Yet it was precisely this very extravagance that set George on a course toward moral and physical decay. In the first 6 weeks of the year 1816 alone, over 2,300 kilograms of meat were delivered to Carlton House, enough to provision an entire army, without even counting the vast quantities of poultry and sausages that accompanied it. Carcasses of venison, boar's head with gilded horns, and whole roasted calves were nightly features. Knights of the realm and foreign dignitaries alike were invited to partake in orgiastic feasts, where platters of oysters, pheasants, and quails were arranged in ostentatious displays, and fountains of Burgundy and champagne flowed freely. After each repast, the regent would slump into a velvet armchair and drift into stupor, his eyelids fluttering as guests exchanged uneasy glances, and wondered whether to offer another glass of Madeira or to slip him away to rest. When he finally ascended the throne in the year 1821, his coronation stood as the crowning folly of his excess. The ceremony racked up expenses approaching £1,000,000, a sum so vast that later historians could scarcely reconcile it with the nation's fiscal records. He appeared clothed in vestments of silver tissue, each seam embroidered with glinting threads of bullion and crowned with over 12,000 diamonds rented just for the occasion. Court poets and caricaturists alike mocked him as the majestic whale in evening dress, and satirical prints depicting a portly monarch cresting upon a gilded hump circulated in every tavern and bookstall. The public's laughter, though hushed at first, grew bolder with every penny of the public purse squandered on such a lavish display. On the political stage, the new king's behaviour inspired neither deference nor loyalty. His hasty meddling in government affairs, marked by impromptu declarations and last-minute reversals, earned him a reputation for capriciousness. Yet even more damaging was his obsessive pursuit of divorce from Queen Caroline, a spectacle that spilled onto the floors of Parliament and into the ink of every newspaper. His ministers found themselves torn between duty to sovereign and duty to country, as they were forced to broker compromises and to draft laws preventing Caroline from claiming her rightful place at court. Each attempt to sideline her fed the public's sense of outrage, for many saw the regent's actions as vindictive and vindication of all their worst suspicions. In response, both Parliament and the Cabinet moved to curtail his authority, seeing the king less as a driving force of governance and more as a figure to be managed. Votes of confidence were delayed, ministry appointments reviewed with unusual scrutiny, and royal expenditures subjected to fresh audits. Whispers spread of a caretaker monarchy, in which George IV's role was to serve as a ceremonial head while serious decisions were made elsewhere. Some elder statesmen advocated for a stricter regency during the months when his appetites were at their peak, fearing that the nation's stability hinged on removing the monarch from daily affairs. Meanwhile, back at Carlton House, the regent continued to live by the credo that money existed solely to feed his desires. He ordered midnight banquets to distract from the political storm clouds gathering overhead, summoning musicians to play nocturnes, as if to lull the world into slumber. Gentle strains of harp and violin drifted through the corridors while the guests ate spiced meats and washed them down with cordials laced with opium. Sleepy laughter mingled with the soft rustle of silk, and the regent himself, crowned yet weary, would drift in and out of consciousness, buoyed by the lingering warmth of wine and the promise of another feast. Thus did the Regency years embody a paradox. Under George IV's fosterage, the arts and architecture flourished in new and dazzling forms, giving London its Regency grace, even as the same expenditures hastened the moral and financial decline of the crown. The halls where painters displayed their latest canvases and sculptors unveiled their marble visions were the very halls where sumptuous meats rotted under heat lamps, and where the regent's form grew ever more bloated. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as the last notes of a minuet faded and the guests shuffled away in drowsy stupor, Carlton House itself seemed to sigh, heavy with the weight of gilded excess and the echo of a monarch's unbridled appetites. In his final years, King George IV sank ever deeper into illness and torment. His weight had surpassed 127 kilograms, and his legs swelled with fluid so severely that staircases became insurmountable obstacles. His vision, once keen, failed him after a botched cataract operation, leaving him unable to read or even discern friends' faces. He could no longer sign documents Parliament resorted to affixing facsimile seals in his stead. Gout, the aristocrat's scourge, ravaged his hands and feet, deforming his fingers into grotesque shapes and rendering the simple act of holding a fork or grasping a pen impossible. His every meal depended upon the ministrations of attendants, who fed him morsel by morsel as he sat propped in a high-backed chair. The skin that once gleamed with royal polish now stretched taut over festering sores. Ulcerations oozed pus that trickled down his flanks and thighs. The stench of decay pervaded every chamber of Carlton House. Visitors, once welcomed with courtly smiles, now gasped for air as they stepped across thresholds. In a desperate bid to avoid confronting the horror of his own form, George forbade the placement of mirrors in his rooms. The sight of his reflection, distorted by swelling flesh, was a torment he refused to endure. His mind, too, succumbed to ruin alongside his body. Paranoia gripped him in restless fits, and he would lash out at servants he believed to be plotting against him. At times, tears of despair streamed silently down his cheeks as he surrendered to crushing depression. Rages would follow, fueled by delirium, as he railed against the failings of medicine and monarchy alike. Laudanum, his constant companion, offered only hollow respite. He swallowed droppers full of the opiate tincture in search of peace, but instead drifted in and out of oblivion, each stupor a reminder of the dissolution of his faculties. Movement became a spectacle of both pity and shame. A custom-built wheelchair, reinforced with iron bands and mounted upon heavy wheels, was the only means by which he could traverse the hallways of his palaces. Servants strained at ropes and pulleys as they guided the chair across thresholds and down corridors. Each journey left the corridors echoing with the wheeze of his laboured breathing. The first gentleman of England had become, in the eyes of his own household, a burden too immense to bear. In the constant haze of pain, George begged incessantly for remedies, tonics promising miraculous recovery, restoratives of every sort, even charlatans' potions distilled from unknown herbs. His chambers were strewn with empty phials and half-finished drafts, testament to a monarch's final desperate gamble against mortality. Yet with each passing sunrise, he found himself neither dead nor restored, but suspended in a liminal state of half-life, trapped within walls that offered neither sanctuary nor solace. Thus did King George IV embody a tragic exemplar of the ruin that accompanies boundless indulgence. His body, bloated and decrepit, mirrored the excesses of his reign, while his spirit, fractured by pain and paranoia, bore witness to the moral decay that paralleled his physical decline. In those final, sleep-laden hours, the whisper of court musicians was replaced by the rasp of his breath, the clink of fine porcelain by the moans of agony. A magnificence once unrivaled dwindled to a solitary figure, locked in a chamber of suffering, cradled by cushions beset with stains, and set against walls heavy with the memory of former glories. And so he drifted between consciousness and oblivion, the candles that once blazed in crystal sconces burning low, casting long shadows across the sumptuous draperies. The echoes of laughter that had once resounded through ballrooms were silenced, replaced by the spectre of one man's ruin. King George IV, who had mounted the throne amid paeans of admiration, now lingered in enforced solitude, an involuntary penitent in the chapel of his own decay. It was here, in these dimly lit rooms, that the final lesson of his life was written. That unbridled appetite, left unchecked by prudence or restraint, exacts a toll so devastating that it devours both body and soul, leaving behind only the hollow echo of a once great name. After the resplendent yet humiliating coronation, King George IV's health continued its precipitous decline. His weight had climbed past 127 kilograms, forcing him to rely on various aids merely to move from one chamber to the next. But perhaps more alarming than his girth was his deepening dependence on laudanum, the liquid opiate that had become his constant refuge. Before each public appearance, the monarch did not hesitate to swallow more than 100 drops of laudanum, an amount sufficient to render a healthy man unconscious. Consequently, George spent much of his time in a dazed stupor, his speech slurred, his thoughts muddled. Diplomats whispered in hushed tones that the King of England seems perpetually befuddled or intoxicated. His vision, once keen and alert, failed him utterly following a botched cataract operation in the year 1829. By the following year, he was all but blind, unable to decipher even the boldest script. Documents requiring royal assent could not bear his trembling hand, and Parliament resorted to affixing facsimile seals in lieu of his signature to keep the machinery of government from grinding to a halt. In the halls of Westminster, the question was no longer whether the monarch would act, but whether he was conscious enough even to sign a decree. Alongside these ocular and cognitive impairments, gout ravaged his joints with merciless consistency. His fingers and toes swelled grotesquely, their shapes warped by bone and uric acid deposits. He could no longer grip a pen or hold a fork, so attendants were forced to feed the king directly, much as one would feed a child. Carlton House, once the scene of glittering receptions, had become more akin to a makeshift infirmary. Camp beds and padded chairs crowded the corridors, and nurses and orderlies flitted about like anxious moths, attending to the sovereign around the clock. The flesh of King George's body had turned against him. Soft tissue, bloated by persistent fluid retention, stretched to the point of cracking. Ulcerations oozed purulent discharge that seeped into his bedclothes and musty rugs. No amount of linen changes or fragrant oils could mask the stench that emanated from his very skin. Indeed, visitors found themselves holding their breath or retreating hastily, unwilling to endure the foul miasma. Attempts to wash the king were largely in vain. The sheer extent of his afflictions defied any effort to restore cleanliness. Physical agony was matched by a psychological unraveling. Unable to bear the reflection of his distorted form, George commanded that all mirrors be removed from his quarters, sparing himself the horror of confronting the visage in which he no longer recognized even a trace of his former self. Paranoia took root like a malignant vine. The king would accuse his attendants of conspiring against him, convinced that each servant's glance or hesitation masked some secret plot. Laudanum, which he consumed in copious quantities to dull the pain, instead unleashed hallucinations. In those fugue states, he muttered incoherent fragments of speech or burst into tears for reasons known only to himself, before lashing out in sudden fits of rage. Carlton House rang with the sounds of his laboured breathing and anguished cries through the long nights. Tormented by excruciating pain, he would thrash upon the sheets until the bedding was soaked, and yet the very exertion of his suffering seemed to offer no relief. At times he would cling to his chamber door with a deathly grip, his nails digging into polished wood, as he begged for some miracle he knew would never come. Yet no miracle arrived. The courtiers and physicians, those who had once bowed before his throne, now watched in wan sorrow as the lavish life they knew fell away, leaving only this man, bound by affliction and isolation. Even in the depths of this grim tableau, small consolations were offered. A warm cupping of brandy to soothe his throat, a gentle application of salves to his wounds, the soft murmur of a lute drone intended to lull him towards sleep. But sleep, the one mercy he most desired, was often elusive. Instead, he drifted in and out of a twilight realm, where pain and sedation intermingled in a haze that neither blessed nor cured. Thus the final years of King George IV unfolded as a tragic coda to his life of excess. His body, once the epitome of regal pomp, had become a prison of swollen flesh and fetid wounds. His mind, once celebrated for wit and charm, lay entangled in opiate-induced delusions and rancorous distrust. In the hush before dawn, as the candles guttered and the court lay dormant, the echo of his suffering lingered in corridors now emptied of splendour. The man who had once revelled in banquets of unimaginable scale now subsisted on the ministrations of others, trapped in a relentless cycle of pain and delirium. And when at last the ravages of disease triumphed, the kingdom witnessed not the passing of a great sovereign, but the harrowing finale of a life consumed, from first feast to final collapse, by the very pleasures he once so extravagantly embraced. In the final chapter of his life, King George IV endured a living imprisonment within his own decaying flesh. Confined almost entirely to his private chambers, he emerged only on rare occasions, carried in a custom-built wheelchair sturdy enough to bear his immense weight. Each movement from room to room became a Herculean task. Pulleys groaned and chains scraped as attendants strained to hoist and lower the chair, their laboured grunts echoing down the grand corridors. To these court servants, once accustomed to reverent obeisance, their sovereign had become little more than a breathing hunk of meat, an object of revulsion rather than respect. The king's moans and gasps reverberated through silent halls where only weeks before his footsteps had paced with command and confidence. Confronted by the stark reality of his decline, George retreated into religious fervour, seeking redemption for a lifetime of excess. He spent hours recounting every debauched affair, every riotous banquet, before startled chaplains who took notes in trembling ink. In these dreadful confessionals, his remorse surfaced in torrents. He pleaded for absolution for sins of gluttony, lust, and waste. Yet each tearful narrative only deepened his despair, for the weight of his guilt pressed upon him as heavily as his failing body. The holy words meant to console him instead became reminders of his irreparable transgressions, a cruel sermon that intensified both his spiritual anguish and his physical torment. Meanwhile, friendships and intimacies unravelled. His longtime companion, the Duke of Conyngham, gradually withdrew, repelled by the malodorous odour emanating from the king's festering wounds. Other confidants, once eager to bask in royal favour, now averted their eyes, or offered half-hearted condolences before departing hastily. Only the servants remained, bound by duty and coin, compelled to tend his every need. They wrapped cloths tightly around their faces to stave off the stench, donned thick leather gloves to avoid direct contact with his swollen flesh, and performed the grim task of cleansing sores that refused to heal. Each day they battled nausea and dread, yet they alone bore witness to the monarch's shameful dissolution. Within the seat of government, alarm spread like wildfire. The prospect of a king permanently incapacitated, unable to sign edicts, greet envoys, or even sit upright sent chills through the corridors of power. Ministers convened in hushed councils to chart a contingency plan for succession. Secret memoranda circulated, outlining procedures for invoking regency powers for William, George's younger brother. Publicly, officials maintained a facade of decorum, issuing statements praising the king's indomitable spirit, while privately they fretted over the kingdom's stability. Outside the palace walls, news of the emperor's plight became fuel for newspapers and satirical prints. Caricaturists depicted the monarch slumped in his wheeled throne, flanked by gagging aides. Headlines alternated between pity and scorn. The wounded sovereign read one, England's great burden read another. A curious crowd gathered at the palace gates, some out of genuine concern, others drawn by morbid fascination. The public's gaze, once uplifted by royal pageantry, now lowered in ambivalent response. An undercurrent of empathy mingled with bitter contempt, as if the populace deemed George's ruin a just consequence of his profligate reign. Amid this atmosphere of dread and derision, the court itself seemed to shudder. Tapestries lining the walls swallowed sound, yet the quiet was broken by the king's intermittent sobs and the hollow boom of his breathing apparatus. The perfumed florals that once scented his bedchamber with lilac and orange blossom were replaced by the sharp tang of antiseptic and the stench of festering flesh. Draperies, once vermilion and gold, hung limp, mottled by the dampness of too many washings. A single beam of daylight, filtering through thickened glass, illuminated motes of dust that danced like restless spirits in the stale air. Despite the turmoil, official dispatches continued to laud the king's personal virtues. Propaganda pieces lauded his past generosity to the arts, his patronage of the Royal Academy, and his supposed patronage of the people. Beneath such flourishes lay an unspoken truth, that the monarch's capacity to govern had been usurped by infirmity. Rarely did a foreign ambassador venture to Carlton House, fearful of witnessing the spectacle firsthand and scandalizing diplomatic decorum. Thus unfolded George's final tenure, an emperor dethroned within his own skin, a shadow of the man who had once presided over Europe's grandest court. His every breath disturbed the heavy drapes. Each moan recalled a banqueting hall where laughter once reigned. In those oppressive rooms, the boundary between palatial splendor and abject ruin dissolved. And while the world beyond carried on Parliament debating tax reforms, merchants haggling in the city within the stone walls of Carlton House, the sombre truth persisted, that unchecked indulgence and the pursuit of pleasure, when left without temperance, can corrode both throne and soul, leaving only a hushed echo of magnificence turned to lament. In his final years, George IV had all but lost the ability to care for himself. He demanded 24-hour attendance, insisting that his pages and nurses remain ever at his side, though in truth they detested the grim duty imposed upon them. Each night he lay awake, compelling his attendants to sit and endure his endless ramblings, tales of imaginary battles at Waterloo, recounted with a strange blend of penitence and menace. Even in these delirious hours, the flow of alcohol never ceased. Champagne and fine claret were poured continuously, their effervescence and warmth meant to soothe a body racked by disease, yet only masking the rasp of each ragged breath. By the year 1829, the king was utterly incapacitated from the business of state. He could no longer decipher the flow of cabinet papers, could not sign his name upon any ordinance, and was physically unable to attend council meetings. The machinery of government ground on without him. Ministers issued proclamations, diplomats negotiated treaties, and civil servants regarded the management of George's frail person as a logistical chore rather than a royal prerogative. To the people, the monarch had transformed from an exalted symbol of sovereignty into a mere ornamental relic of an age past. Parliament, alarmed by the prospect of a sovereign rendered comatose by illness and indulgence, began to contemplate formal regency measures or even emergency powers to supplant his authority should he become wholly incapable. Privy councillors huddled behind closed doors, drafting memoranda that laid the groundwork for transferring executive functions to Prince William, the king's younger brother. Though the official bulletins from Kensington Palace continued to speak of temporary indispositions, rumours of George's pitiable condition spread like wildfire through the streets and taverns of London. Within the palace, royal artists such as Sir David Wilkie lamented the necessity of capturing the king's likeness. In the year 1829, Wilkie wrote that painting his portrait was the most dismal commission he had ever undertaken, for no amount of brushwork or flattering chiaroscuro could conceal the decay that had overtaken the monarch's once noble form. Even the most skilled court painter had to confront the harsh reality that no artistic magic could restore vitality to the flesh, now bloated and collapsing under its own weight. George's body, a battleground for ailments, both physical and psychic, seemed to rebel at every turn. Gout's cruel grip on his joints left him unable to shift from one cushion to another without moans that echoed through the ornate halls. His respiratory labours, punctuated by rattling coughs, turned prayers for relief into pleas for any remedy that might prolong his miserable existence. Laudanum, which he imbibed in staggering doses, offered only transient oblivion before plunging him back into a haze of disorientation and shame. The courtiers, once radiant in the glow of royal favour, now skirted the corridors with furtive glances, uncertain whether to offer sympathy or distance themselves from the spectacle. Palace life, which had thrived on glittering receptions and whispered intrigues, settled into a tense hush, broken only by the creak of George's wheelchair and the hushed prayers of those charged with tending his battered form. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the public's faith in the monarchy waned. The very symbol of national unity had become a cautionary tale of excess, a warning to all of the perils inherent in unchecked indulgence. Satirical prints flourished, depicting the king as a bloated figure glued to his throne, a grotesque monument to human frailty. London's newspapers ran headlines that mixed pity with derision: "The Doomed Monarch," or "England's Great Shadow," each recalling the glory the crown once commanded. Thus, the last chapter of George IV's reign unfolded as a slow, sombre procession toward oblivion. The pomp and circumstance of courtly life receded into dim memory, replaced by the constant vigil of nurses and the clamour of medical instruments. Ministers convened with growing urgency to ensure continuity of governance, while the king himself remained locked in a twilight realm of pain and sedation. In those final, weary hours, as the candles guttered and the attendants whispered prayers, the once magnificent sovereign lay confined to his chamber, a living testament to the inevitable decline that accompanies a life spent in untempered splendour. As the bitter end drew near, King George IV's health deteriorated with alarming rapidity. Heart disease and dropsy, the aristocrat's curse, left his chest constricted and his limbs engorged. He could no longer lie supine upon a bed, but instead was forced to rest propped upright with pillows at right angles, his head and shoulders buoyed against the cavernous gloom of Carlton House. The skin that once bore the sheen of courtly polish had become a taut drum, stretched perilously over swollen flesh. Boils and ulcers erupted in clusters, their surfaces cracking and oozing foul-smelling discharge that seeped into his bedding. For weeks he received no bath. The house grew heavy with the stench of decay, so potent that visiting dignitaries at Windsor Castle were advised to press handkerchiefs dampened with eau de cologne over nose and mouth in order to endure even a brief audience. Within the palace, routine became ritualized misery. Attendants, clad in starched liveries now faded and stained, administered unending ministrations. They softened the edges of stiff linens to avoid tearing the king's fragile skin, gently cleaning each fold and crevice with sponges soaked in warm water and antiseptic solutions. Yet the enormity of his frame rendered all attempts at hygiene hopeless. One servant, assigned the grim task of washing the royal back, confessed later that he spent more than an hour each day reaching impossible crevices, only to find fresh suppuration by the next dawn. Despite their efforts, the odour persisted, a constant reminder that beneath the finery and powdered wig lay a body teetering on the edge of ruin. In those final weeks, the monarch's reliance upon laudanum reached its fever pitch. He swallowed draught after draught of the opiate tincture, seeking oblivion but finding only disorientation. He would drift in and out of what he believed to be the tumult of Waterloo, shouting orders to phantom cavalry with tear-streaked cheeks and a quavering voice. Yet as quickly as the illusions arrived, they evaporated into fresh despair. He would awaken to find himself still confined to his boudoir, the scent of opiate and decay swirling in the lamplight. On occasions he mistook his attendants for enemies, railing at them for betrayal and false counsel. Their hearts pounded with dread at each accusation, for they knew that the king's feeble grasp on reality could snap at any moment into hysteria. At other times, he surrendered to sorrow so profound that his eyes swelled with tears of bitter regret. He lamented the squandered years of youth, the extravagant banquets, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the velvet-lined revels that once defined his reign. "What valour have I left to claim?" he moaned to a startled page. "I lived only for indulgence, and now my body betrays me utterly." His confidants, summoned to witness these confessions, felt themselves trapped in a nightmare of royal penance. The room's plush draperies and gilt-framed portraits that once projected regal authority now bore witness to the collapse of mind and spirit. As his physical and mental agony intertwined, even the concept of time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights, and nights into days, an endless cycle of laudanum haze interrupted only by pangs of pain so sharp that the king would clutch at his own robes, searching for purchase on a body that had become alien to him. The courtiers, accustomed to the measured cadence of court life, now tiptoed through corridors haunted by muffled sobs and the intermittent crackle of fire logs attempting to stave off chill. The grand clocks in the entryways marked the passage of hours, but each chime served only to deepen the suffocating stillness that reigned in the private chambers. Outside, the world continued under the unblinking skies of London. Parliament debated matters of commerce and war, while the public newspapers chronicled rumours of the king's condition with a mixture of fascination and disdain. Yet within the hushed confines of the palace, neither politics nor pageantry held any sway. The throne, once the epicentre of power and ceremony, now stood empty, its occupant, too frail to rise from his chair. His sceptre and crown lay untouched upon a crimson cushion, symbols of authority unclaimed in the shadow of mortal frailty. In the hushed pre-dawn hours, as a low wind whispered through the trees of Windsor Great Park, King George IV drifted between worlds, his spirit buffeted by phantoms of past glories and the relentless ache of flesh undone. The flickering candlelight cast elongated shadows across the walls, where portraits of ancestors glared down with silent reproach. Here in this sleep-soaked chamber, the final chapter of his life unfolded. A cautionary tale of pleasure unbridled, and the inexorable toll it exacts upon both body and soul. And as he lay on the brink of oblivion, the last remnants of the first gentleman of England faded into a whisper, drowned out by the hush of death's approaching footsteps. In the long, oppressive dusk of June in the year 1830, King George IV approached the apex of his suffering. On the night of the 25th of June, he writhed in agony as his pallid flesh turned a ghastly hue of grey. Each breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, as though his very lungs quivered under the weight of countless excesses. A small cadre of physicians, among whom Sir William Waller, one of the few ophthalmologists who had remained steadfastly by his side, kept vigil around his bedside. They exchanged anxious glances in the flickering candlelight, measuring the intervals between his laboured pants. As the mansion clocks chimed the hour of 3 in the morning on the 26th, the king's agony reached its grim zenith. Without warning, he erupted in a gush of internal hemorrhage, a catastrophic rupture of a gastric blood vessel, the culmination of decades of overindulgence in wine and opiates, of flesh stretched far beyond its natural bounds. His final, agonized cry, "Sir Henry Halford," resounded through the hushed alcoves, calling to the royal physician who was not at his side. Then, at precisely 3:15 antimeridiem, the ceaseless throb of his dying heart stilled, and the prodigious figure of the monarch slumped into an eerie stillness, ending a prolonged saga of splendour, excess, and decay. The post-mortem examination revealed the full extent of his bodily ruin. A mantle of adipose tissue enveloped his heart and kidneys, compressing them with merciless force. His liver bore the indelible scars of chronic alcoholism, its architecture distorted by cirrhosis, while the gastric vessel that had yielded under pressure lay open and hemorrhaging. These grim findings confirmed what many physicians had long suspected. George had eaten and imbibed himself into the grave. News of his passing spread swiftly through the streets of London. Yet where one might expect tears, a muted relief prevailed. The populace, wearied by years of watching their sovereign's slow demise, marked his end with hushed celebration. Even the Times, Britain's most esteemed newspaper, issued an obituary laced with bitter irony. Who has ever wept for him? Who really felt one unfeigned pang of sorrow? Such impassioned reproach echoed the sentiments of citizens who had long viewed George as a costly embarrassment rather than a figure of veneration. In the days that followed, throngs gathered at Windsor Castle not to pay respects, but to gawk at the immense cedar coffin lined with Spanish mahogany and sheathed in lead. Its gargantuan dimensions required palace corridors to be fortified with heavy oak planks, lest the floorboards buckle. Lowering the coffin into the royal vault was no simple matter. Pulleys and steel beams were installed to guide its descent, the metallic groans echoing like a dirge throughout the chapel. The funeral rites at St. George's Chapel were as subdued as they were unceremonious. Conversations filled the sacred space with low murmurs. Not a single tear was shed. The decorum of black mourning attire was observed, but no genuine grief seemed to stir within the assembly. Even the Duke of Wellington, who had once known George intimately, spat out his verdict without hesitation. "He was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life." Such harsh appraisal from Britain's greatest military hero struck many as tragically apt. And when William IV ascended the throne, a collective sigh of relief swept over the nation. Hope rekindled for a reign marked by basic competence rather than chronic debauchery. Thus concluded the extraordinary, tragic tale of George IV, a sovereign whose reign spanned from gilded pageantry to grotesque infirmity, whose final breath was prelude to a kingdom's uneasy release. In death, as in life, he remained a figure of paradox. Once the first gentleman of England, he departed as a cautionary monument to the perils of unbridled excess, leaving behind nothing but the hollow echoes of his own undoing. The post-mortem examination of King George IV laid bare the tragic consequences of 3 decades of unbridled physical indulgence. When the royal physicians opened his chest and abdomen, they found an astonishing mantle of adipose tissue enveloping virtually every vital organ. A thick layer of fat pressed relentlessly against his heart and kidneys, constricting them until their function was reduced to a mere whisper of life. The gastric vessels, weakened by years of pressure and inflammation, had finally given way in that fateful hour on the 26th of June, causing the catastrophic hemorrhage that ended his existence. Further examination revealed a liver transformed into a mottled, fibrotic mass, its tissue hardened and scarred by chronic alcoholism. The once resilient organ had lost its elasticity entirely, unable to process toxins or regenerate healthy cells. His lungs likewise bore the marks of long-standing congestion. They were compressed beneath the weight of encasing fat and fluid, leaving him to gasp for breath even at rest. The contour of his ribcage, now rounded and immobile, told the story of a body too bloated to expand its own lungs fully. As the coroners probed deeper, they also detected traces of laudanum, the opiate tincture that George had consumed in copious amounts to dull both pain and conscience. Its metabolites in his blood provided incontrovertible evidence of a habit that had numbed his body even as it eroded his mind. These findings dispelled any notion that George's demise was a simple case of natural causes. Instead, his death was a medical tragedy of the highest order, the direct outcome of eating and drinking oneself to death. The grotesque compression of organs under layers of excessive flesh, the ruptured gastric vessel dripping life away, and the fibrotic liver all combined to illustrate a grim doctrine in living colour. In the parlance of the age, he had been consumed by his own appetites, a vivid toxin for future generations regarding the perils of unchecked obesity, habitual intemperance, and opiate dependency. Yet, despite the profound medical lessons at hand, the scientific community of the 1830s did little to transform these revelations into systematic study. Instead, the coroner's report was appropriated chiefly as a moral exemplum, a lurid cautionary tale, rather than a spur to clinical research. Periodicals reprinted passages from the Autopsy, emphasizing the enormity of the fat deposits and the bile-tinged fluid in his lungs, as though each anatomical horror were a chapter in a sermon against vice. Lecturers in Edinburgh and London would hold up sketches of the dissected organs as evidence of how luxury unchecked by discipline can ravage the body and the soul alike. In the bustling shops of Fleet Street, engraved illustrations of the post-mortem findings circulated alongside cartoons mocking the fallen monarch. One widely reproduced print showed an oversized king's heart, dwarfed by a massive ring of adipose, with the caption, "Where duty died beneath fat." Another depicted the ruptured stomach vessel gushing crimson, a grotesque parody of the regal pageantry of his former coronation. These images reinforced public sentiment that George's ruin was both deserved and instructive, a potent reminder that opulence and decadence exact a terrible price. Within hospital wards, however, the potential for learning from George's demise went largely unrealized. Medical journals of the day noted the case with clinical detachment, but offered scant follow-up on therapeutic measures or preventive guidelines. Instead, the discourse remained narrowly moralistic, urging individuals to adopt temperance and moderation in diet and drink, but without the empirical frameworks that modern pathology would later demand. Thus, the legacy of the post-mortem was twofold. It stoked the flames of ridicule and moralization in the public square, and it left untouched a trove of pathological data that might have advanced early 19th century medicine. George IV's body, once encased in regal finery, had become a vault of knowledge, a grim museum exhibit that history would remember for its sensational spectacle rather than its instructive scientific yield. In the quiet aftermath, as the ink dried on official bulletins and the crowds dispersed from Windsor Castle. The true cost of his reign lingered unanswered. The sumptuous banquets, the glittering balls, the endless toasts, all had culminated in a tableau of anatomical ruin. And though the moralizing print shops proclaimed the autopsy a clarion call against excess, the era's medical establishment remained content to observe rather than to probe, to admonish rather than to understand. In that somnolent juncture between spectacle and scholarship, the post-mortem of George IV became less a catalyst for progress than a memento mori, a grim reminder that the body, like the empire it served, can be undone by its own insatiable appetites. News of King George IV's death spread through London like a chill wind, met less with sorrow than with a quiet, almost furtive celebration. Unlike the customary mourning for a monarch, the public gazed upon George's passing as the fitting punishment for a life spent in boundless indulgence. To many, he was no longer a sovereign, but merely a corpulent husk, a living testament to the perils of excess. When the Times printed his obituary, there was scarcely an attempt at decorous restraint. Its biting headline asked, "What eye has ever wept for him? What heart has heaved a single unregret sorrow?" Such pointed questions captured the prevailing mood. George had never known true friendship, and his departure left behind only relief rather than lamentation. In the days that followed, Fleet Street's presses hummed eagerly, turning out satirical lithographs and cartoons that compared his massive coffin to a giant meat cart. Street vendors hawked prints depicting the royal bier wedged through reinforced palace corridors, as though the king himself had become a sideshow attraction. "Behold the rump of England," one caricature proclaimed, showing the ornate coffin atop the palace steps, while a grotesque bustle of rotting beef spilled forth from its seams. Another print offered a more macabre tableau. Crowds gathered around Windsor Castle's iron gates, some with handkerchiefs pressed to their nostrils, sniffing the rumour, no, the very essence of decay that lingered in the air. Such crude amusement was not confined to cartoons. Social chatter in coffeehouses and taverns carried a tone of sardonic glee. In smog-choked rooms lit by gas lamps, patrons toasted the end of George's reign with pints of porter, murmuring that at last England could expunge its shameful chapter of royal gluttony. Barmaids, accustomed to overhearing the murmurs of statesmen and merchants, passed the tankard with lowered voices, allowing even barflies to feel complicit in the unspoken relief rippling through society. His body weighed more than his crown. An elderly dockworker rasped as he drained his mug. And now he lies so humbly in that monstrous box. At the palace gates in Windsor, curious spectators squeezed through iron railings to glimpse the grand coffin laid out for public viewing. Some, driven by a tasteless curiosity, claimed they could detect a faint buzz of rancid scent wafting from within the royal apartments. Others, less bold, peered through slits in the heavy drapery, satisfied simply to see the leaden lid carved with intricate heraldry. For them, the scene was not one of solemn respect, but of morbid fascination. A final opportunity to witness the decaying remnant of the king's once proud frame. Meanwhile, in the hushed sanctity of St. George's Chapel, low voices echoed through stone vaults as mourners filed past the kneeling stool where official condolences were offered. Yet these expressions of grief rang hollow. No tear-stained kerchiefs fluttered in the dim light. No wails of sorrow punctuated the silent vigil. A handful of courtiers, their gowns trailing like sombre banners, recalled past favours and tender moments. But their reverence felt obligatory rather than sincere. Even the simple act of crossing oneself seemed perfunctory, a ritual performed out of duty rather than devotion. Outside the chapel, more than one foreign diplomat was overheard, remarking that he had never witnessed such a mute funeral. Ambassadors from Prussia, Russia, and Austria lingered by the portals, exchanging wary glances as if uncertain whether to follow local custom or to flee from a spectacle that had lost all regal dignity. The French envoy, whose own king had departed in a very different manner, mused that London's aristocracy might consider loosening its corsets of tradition to prevent such a grotesque repeat. In the immediate aftermath, the nation found itself at a curious crossroads. Some gentlemen, recovering from lamplit nights of revelry and gossip, penned letters to acquaintances in the countryside, urging them to remember George's downfall as a cautionary tale against intemperance. Others, with perhaps more mischievous intent, wrote lampoons that recast the late king as a cautionary caricature In pamphlets circulated across Surrey and Berkshire, schools of caricaturists and poets vied for the most cutting lines, hoping to outdo one another in the art of derision. Yet, amidst the mockery and relief, there lingered an undercurrent of unease. The monarchy, long viewed as a pillar of English identity, had been laid low by its own extravagance. Citizens who once found comfort in the stability of the crown now questioned whether any sovereign, no matter how decorous, might be similarly corrupted by power and privilege. Philosophy clubs in upscale salons debated the meaning of royal duty as chandeliers swayed overhead, while salons in Mayfair wrestled with the notion that a ruler's personal indulgences could bring an entire institution to the brink of ridicule. But for the majority of Londoners, the mood remained distinctly lightened by George's demise. The gruesome details of his funeral and the grotesque display of his coffin had done what no reform bill ever could. They reminded the public that no man, however lofty his station, could outrun the consequences of his own excesses. And so, in the quiet hours after dawn, as the city roused itself from a night of whispered delights and scandalous prints, England breathed its collective sigh. King George IV was gone finally, irrevocably, and in the lingering hush that followed, the people tasted, for the first time in years, the simple balm of ordinary life, unclouded by royal debauchery. The funeral of King George IV unfolded as a spectacle of sheer absurdity, a pageantry that strained the very limits of royal decorum. The first challenge fell to the undertakers. They commissioned a massive coffin of Spanish mahogany, its interior sheathed in a lead lining thick enough to contain both the king's immense bulk and the fetid odours that still lingered within his decaying form. Carpenters laboured day and night, sealing each joint of the chestnut-hued wood and fastening heavy iron bands to reinforce the structure. When at last it stood complete, the coffin was so ponderous that the palace corridors had to be shored up with planks of oak, laid across the marble floors to prevent cracking under the coffin's tremendous weight. Beyond these precautionary measures, a system of pulleys and steel beams was erected above the royal vault in St. George's Chapel for lowering the bier into the stone recess without mishap. The scaffold creaked ominously when tested, each metallic groan echoing like a foreboding drumbeat. Some workmen, their shirt sleeves damp with sweat, exchanged uneasy glances as they prepared for the day when the coffin would descend into its final resting place. In theory, these engineering feats were the height of prudence. In practice, they underscored the grotesque magnitude of the task at hand. When the morning of the funeral arrived, the cortege moved at a crawl. Knights in tarnished armour trudged alongside plumed carriages, their boots echoing on the temporary wooden walkways. The pallbearers, 8 in number, and chosen for their sturdiest physique, struggled visibly under their burden. Members of the court, resplendent in funeral black, shifted from foot to foot, their heels clicking in morose complaint. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Too heavy, too long. An insult to our endurance. Attendees leaned on one another, stifling yawns and rubbing cramped calves as the procession meandered through the palace precincts. Inside the hallowed aisles of St. George's Chapel, the atmosphere was eerily devoid of genuine mourning. Instead, a low murmur buzzed among the marble columns, punctuated by the occasional rustle of silk and a clandestine smirk. Eyes flicked toward the lead-lined casket as it lay atop a raised bier, a colossal testament to the life and death of a monarch who had, in his final years, become more burden than sovereign. Visitors craned their necks, as though expecting the once grand figure to stir within his wooden prison. A handful of curious onlookers even pressed their palms against the cool stone railings, seeking confirmation that he had indeed breathed his last. Mourning badges, once symbols of heartfelt loss, were pinned to lapels with mechanical regularity rather than genuine grief. The royal cleric intoned passages from the liturgy, his voice solemn yet distant, reverberating through the vaulted ceiling. No coughing interrupted the recitation. The hush was more a product of collective disbelief than respect. A few women dabbed at their eyes with lace handkerchiefs, but whether those tears were for sorrow or simply for show, none could say. Fathers gently hushed restless children seated in the galleries, for whom this grand funeral was less a rite of passage and more a bizarre exhibition. As the service concluded, the coffin was readied for its descent. The pulleys creaked again, this time under the weight of the real thing. The assembled crowd held its breath as the steel beams gradually lowered the mahogany sarcophagus into the vault. A soft thud marked its final resting place, and the hush that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. No lamentation broke the silence. Instead, an almost imperceptible sigh passed through those assembled, a release, perhaps, from the macabre pageant that had so thoroughly upended royal tradition. Outside, the skies had turned a drowsy grey, as though the heavens themselves were nodding off. The wind whispered through the ancient oaks of Windsor Great Park, carrying away the last echoes of clattering wheels and snapping girders. Courtiers filed out in pairs, their black cloaks trailing like the tails of listless birds. Some paused at the palace gates, casting one final glance at the closed doors behind which the king now lay. Others turned away quickly, unwilling to carry the memory of that overblown funeral into the bright afternoon. Thus ended the chaotic farewell to George IV, a funeral less an act of remembrance than a testament to logistical excess and societal fatigue. No elegiac verse was penned in its honour, no public square filled with mournful verse. Instead, the collective sigh of relief that permeated London served as eulogy enough, an unspoken acknowledgement that the burdens of crown and coffin alike had finally been laid to rest. In the hush that followed, the kingdom exhaled, brushing away the dust of scandal and spectacle, and turning its gaze toward a future less encumbered by the grotesque tragedies of unchecked indulgence. Immediately after the funeral, public discourse turned once more to the contested legacy of George IV. Among the voices that carried the greatest weight was that of the Duke of Wellington, the nation's foremost hero and statesman, who delivered a verdict both stark and unforgiving. He was the worst man I ever fell in with in my whole life. Such a scathing appraisal reverberated through the highest echelons of British politics and society, as courtiers and commoners alike mulled over the meaning of a reign so marked by excess and folly. In the days that followed, commentators compared the new monarch, William IV, to his ill-starred brother. William's accession was greeted with a palpable sense of relief. Indeed, some described it as the deliverance of the crown from the nightmarish spectre of George IV. Whereas his predecessors' every movement had been shadowed by scandal, Dickensian infirmity, and scandal once more, William brought a reputation for straightforward, if unremarkable, competence. True, he possessed his own foibles, a fondness for sea voyages, born of his time as a naval commander, a brusque manner that sometimes bordered on coarse, but these seemed almost saintly by comparison to the flamboyant indulgences of George. The tone at court shifted accordingly. Where once elaborate banquets had reigned supreme, now a tempered sobriety settled over state dinners. Members of Parliament, who had laboured under the burden of managing George's incapacitated person, welcomed the prospect of a sovereign who could actually read dispatches, sign treaties, and judge petitions without the need for facsimile seals. Debates in the House of Commons, which had sometimes been overshadowed by the spectre of the regent's whims, regained a sense of normalcy. Bills once stalled by concern over the king's mood now proceeded apace, and ministers found themselves liberated to pursue policy unfettered by the unpredictable eccentricities of the former monarch. Yet the shadow of William's brother lingered in public memory. Architectural and artistic achievements funded by George IV, such as the Royal Pavilion at Brighton and the extensive renovations at Windsor Castle, continued to draw admiration. Visitors to Brighton still marvelled at the exotic domes and slipper-shaped windows of the pavilion, a structure that fused Indian motifs with Regency elegance in a testament to George's patronage of the arts. Windsor Castle's grand new state apartments, adorned with neoclassical columns and gilt-framed frescoes, stood as further evidence that, for all his faults, George had contributed to the cultural fabric of the realm. But these contributions, once celebrated as the pinnacle of refined taste, were now re-examined with sharper criticism. Many wondered whether worthy projects might have been accomplished without the profligate spending and ethical lapses that had accompanied them. Could Brighton have shone as brilliantly on half the budget? A clubman at White's mused aloud, stirring his Madeira with contemplative care. Poets and pamphleteers echoed such sentiments in verse and prose, contrasting the architectural grace of the pavilion with the moral disarray of the man who had commissioned it. Wellington's acerbic judgment spurred others to weigh in. Leading financiers revisited the ledgers of George's extravagances, calculating the opportunity costs of lavish balls, sumptuous feasts, and diamond-studded coronation robes. They calculated that, had those funds been directed toward infrastructure or education, the kingdom might have gained schools, canals, or hospitals, instead of corset-waisted gowns and silver gilt. In the columns of periodicals, essays appeared urging greater oversight of royal expenditures, calling for parliamentary approval of large-scale projects to prevent a recurrence of such fiscal recklessness. Nonetheless, even as the public aired its grievances, there remained a grudging acknowledgement that without George's lavish patronage, certain artistic movements might never have flourished. His largesse had enabled painters, sculptors, and architects to innovate without the constraints of modest budgets. The Royal Academy had grown in prestige under his sponsorship, and young artists found themselves commissioned to create works for Carlton House and its successors. Thus, the age of George IV was remembered not solely for its scandal, but also for its contribution to the aesthetic character of early 19th century Britain. For William IV, the path forward lay in reconciling these dual legacies. He presided over the same throne, yet wielded it with a restraint his brother had famously lacked. In his inaugural speech to Parliament, he pledged to govern with prudence and moderation, signalling a deliberate departure from the flamboyant reign that had just ended. His more modest coronation ceremony, stripped of its predecessor's diamond-studded excesses, served as a public rebuke of George's final gaudy spectacle. By choosing simpler regalia and ordering a scaled-back celebration, William signalled that the monarchy could still command respect without descending into grotesquerie. In parlours and salons, savants debated whether this new tone would endure or whether the lure of grandeur would someday reclaim the throne. Gentlemen in London clubs spoke of the regency paradox, wherein the artistic brilliance of an era clashed with the moral bankruptcy of its patron. To them, the reign of George IV offered both cautionary lessons and enduring marvels. As they reclined in leather chairs by glowing hearths, mugs of ale in hand, they pondered the shape of Britain's future monarchy, one balanced delicately between the twin demands of spectacle and sobriety. Thus, the aftermath of George IV's funeral became a crucible for national reflection. The public surveyed the ruin of his extravagant reign, and in doing so, reaffirmed its hopes for a sober, stable, and accountable monarchy under William IV. Yet the architectural gems and artistic ventures born of George's patronage endured as complex testaments to the dual nature of power, creative and destructive, uplifting and ruinous. In that drowsy twilight of memory and critique, Britain prepared to move beyond the caricature of a king undone by his own appetites. Even as the question lingered, could any monarch navigate the fine line between liberality and excess without repeating the tragic fate of George IV? History remembers George IV not as an eminent monarch, but as a stark warning of the ultimate consequences of unbridled excess. In his lifetime, the virtues of frugality, modesty, and public duty, hallmarks of good governance, were entirely eclipsed by his relentless pursuit of personal ambition and insatiable appetite for power and luxury. Rather than leave behind a legacy of enlightened leadership or civic achievement, George bequeathed to posterity only a cautionary tragedy, a reign defined by extravagance, the profligate squandering of the public purse, and the ruinous toll of unchecked indulgence. By the close of his tenure, the once celebrated First Gentleman of England had become synonymous with spectacle and waste. His glittering court, which dazzled Europe with sumptuous balls and princely patronage of the arts, stood in tragic contrast to the near voyeuristic fascination his decay provoked. Planners tallying the cost of his coronation, nearly £1 million in silver-threaded robes and diamonds, could only marvel at how such expenditures might have funded hospitals, schools, or bridges. Instead, George's reign offered no enduring institution or policy worthier of remembrance than the lesson that excess, when left unabated, corrodes both state and soul. In the decades following his death, historians have largely concurred that George IV's legacy is nothing more than a sombre footnote on the perils of extravagance. His administration saw no great reforms, no landmark treaties, no expansion of civil liberties. Rather, it afforded an almost operatic demonstration of how absolute power, untempered by self-restraint, degenerates into corruption. Scholars have sometimes lamented the lost opportunity. A king so lavish might have been an equally generous patron of public works, had only he balanced splendour with stewardship. From a medical standpoint, George's demise should have represented a pivotal moment in understanding the twin afflictions of obesity and addiction. His autopsy unveiled a body ravaged by layers of adipose tissue, a liver hardened by chronic alcoholism, and traces of laudanum in every vein, an anatomical atlas of self-destruction. Yet the early 19th century medical community was ill-prepared to translate these findings into systematic study. Instead of pioneering research into the physiology of compulsive overeating or the long-term consequences of opiate use, physicians allowed the case to slip into moralistic anecdote. The king's demise became a sermon against vice, not a springboard for clinical insight. Even as the steam-powered mills of the Industrial Revolution began to transform Britain's social and economic landscape, George's story endured as a grim allegory. In Victorian histories, he was often bracketed alongside other moral exemplar: the dissipated nobleman undone by wine, the ruinous aristocrat swallowed by debt, the ruler who lost his throne to personal debauchery. Few accounts sought to salvage any redeeming feature of his persona. He had gifted England architectural marvels and courtly patronage. Yet these tributes were judged insufficient to outweigh the broader calamity of his misrule. Well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, popular memory cast George IV as the quintessential living corpse, a grotesque embodiment of vanity and avarice. Penny dreadfuls and melodramatic novels borrowed his name to titillate readers with tales of tattered finery and perfumed decay. In public lectures on hygiene and morality, lecturers would hold up his case as a dire warning that the very trappings of civilization, when turned to excess, become the instruments of one's undoing. His coffin, Spanish mahogany lined with lead, featured in countless printed sermons as the physical proof of his fatal imbalance. Today, scholars sometimes refer to him wryly as the Zombie King, trapped in an opulent tomb of his own making, neither robust enough to govern nor wise enough to curtail his appetites. He remains a spectral figure at the edge of British history, simultaneously real and unreal, a man of flesh and folly whose final years were spent in a self-inflicted penance of pain and denial. As a symbol, he casts a long shadow over every debate on the responsibilities of those in power, for whom public office is not a license to indulge, but a solemn trust to uphold. George IV's life story endures as a lesson that absolute authority, if divorced from accountability, will inevitably yield ruin. Similarly, the pursuit of pleasure without measure corrodes the spirit, even as it ravages the body. His long, unhappy demise, streaming with tears of regret, grotesquely punctuated by bursts of opiate-fueled delirium, stands as a chilling admonition. The very traits that allowed him to ascend the throne, charisma, confidence, taste for grandeur, became the chains that bound him to a fate of grotesque spectacle and ultimate decay. In the hush of historic memory, one can still sense the echo of his last breath. It lingers in the halls of Carlton House, in the faded frescoes of the Royal Pavilion, and in the cautionary accounts penned by later generations. For George IV, the crown was not a bulwark against ruin, but the glittering weight that crushed him. And so, as the final candles gutter in the sepia-toned pages of history, his tale remains a sleepy murmur, a voice warning us that privilege unbridled is perilously close to self-destruction, and that the most opulent life may end in the loneliest of tombs. And now, as the candles in the great hall gently gutter down to their last flickers, take a slow, deep breath and let go of every tension lingering in your mind. Allow the tale of George IV's extravagant and tragic life to close softly in the night, serving as a gentle lesson on the limits of ambition and the consequences of boundless excess. His journey from dazzling triumphs to the darkest final days has shown us that true endurance lies in compassion, moderation, and a sense of duty. When power and wealth take precedence, one easily becomes lost in a labyrinth of desire, awakening only when it is far too late. But you who are listening now can find serenity apart from such temptations, rediscovering the peaceful self that knows plenty and lives in balance. Like a thin veil of mist dissolving into the ether, the final image of that fallen king slowly fades away, yielding to the stillness of the night and the gentle glow of moon and stars. In that moment between wakefulness and dreaming, you will feel the night cradle you, its soft embrace guiding each measured breath. And here, whispered close to your ear, is this soothing refrain: you deserve tranquility. You deserve to rest in peaceful, sweet dreams. The story you have heard is more than a memory of a living corpse monarch. It carries a profound message about the value of humility, gratitude, and faith in life's simplest pleasures. Though existence may be vast, Cherish every quiet moment, hold each full breath with tenderness, and rise each day by the strength of your own hands and heart. And now, as your eyelids grow heavy, let peace fill your soul and the cool night air rock you into a gentle slumber. We deeply thank you for journeying with us to this final moment, and if you have enjoyed these restful minutes with our story, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss the newest and most captivating videos we create. Good night, and may your dreams be as soft and soothing as the breath of the night.